If you're a hobby baker like me, you probably know the struggle if your bread turns out just flat. I've been trying so many different techniques to get more oven spring from my sourdough, and after 3 years of trying different techniques, I think it all boils down to one trick, and this is what this video is about. It took me a while to get there, but then I had this aha moment. I was baking 2 loaves. I wanted to test little work and a lot of work. A lot of work meaning autolysis, bench kneading, lamination, hourly stretch and folds, and so on. Whereas little work, just putting everything together and letting the dough ferment. And you're probably thinking now, what? There is no difference. And that's exactly what I was thinking. I was almost crying because I invested so much work in all the doughs all the time. And let me make that even clearer. I'll be showing you a one-by-one comparison next to each other right now. The difference is only marginal, right? So left hand side, probably 5 minutes of work, right hand side, almost an hour of work. And this really made me realize that the secret of baking amazing bread at home was always right there in front of my eyes. I was just way too blind to see it. And that is proper fermentation. If your fermentation is way off, then you can do all the technique you want. It won't help you. Your bread won't be as good. If you have amazing fermentation, if you master the whole process from start to finish, then yes, with additional technique you can make an even more amazing bread. But if the basis is bad, your bread is going to be bad. And then came a happy moment. I baked one of the best breads I ever did in my life. Plus, I had it right on camera to share with you. I was bulk fermenting the same dough. I divided it and I bulk fermented one piece for 6 hours and the other piece for 8 hours. And this is what happened. The dough that I bulk fermented for 8 hours became way too flat, whereas the dough that I bulk fermented for 6 hours had an excellent, superb oven spring. One of the best breads I baked so far. You can't believe how stupid this has made me feel. It was always right there, fermentation, but I didn't see it. And now let me put that into 3 actionable points for you that you should follow to become a fermentation master. And number 1, and I see many people lacking this, is a healthy and active sourdough starter. Your sourdough starter should be doubling in size after feeding it a 1:1:1 ratio within around 5 hours or so. If your starter is not that active, especially after you removed it from the fridge, keep feeding your sourdough twice a day until you get to this level of activity. Definitely make sure that you use whole wheat or even whole rye flour to feed your sourdough starter. Only proceed with all the recipes the moment you have this level of activity. Else your timings will be way off. You will not be able to follow any of the timings listed in the recipes. Which brings us to point number 2, the correct amount of bulk fermentation. Bulk fermentation starts the moment you added your starter to the dough. The yeast and the bacteria both eat your dough. And yes, they literally eat your dough. The yeast will eat the dough and they will fart. And this is what inflates your dough. The gas inflates your dough. The bacteria, on the other hand, the bacteria eats your dough and creates acid. This creates the superb taste of the sourdough, the acidy note. Now imagine you're trying to inflate a balloon. And this is actually me trying to inflate my dough. What I did is I extracted all the gluten and then I used a straw trying to inflate it just to visualize what's happening. Because this is exactly what we're doing. Simplified, we're just trying to inflate a balloon. We're trying to get maximum expansion. There's one problem though, and that problem is that the acid that's created by the bacteria, that acid is going to attack the gluten structure of our dough. So over time, if you don't hit that sweet spot, your dough might have too much acid and the gluten can no longer hold together. And you will notice that your dough overfermented when you try to stretch and fold it and it just starts sticking to your hand. Before everything was great and now suddenly it's a sticky mess. Now enough theory, let me show you what that means exactly in practice. First up is a dough which I bulk fermented for 6 hours and then followed by a dough which I fermented for 8 hours. Let's have a look. So I'm starting to coil fold the dough and everything is looking nice. I used watered hands. The dough is coming together just beautifully. It sticks a little bit to my hand, but that's completely normal. It almost doesn't stick at all. A very good looking, very inflated dough. Perfect. Next up, I'm going to start shaping it. I'm flipping over the container And now I will be using the dough's stickiness to shape it together. Adding a little bit of flour, now folding the dough over, folding the other side. You can see the dough is not sticking to my hand. What a nice rewarding dough. This dough is really doing a good job. Take it out, roll it inwards, and there we go. Good looking dough. And next up, exactly the same dough which I separated after I mixed in the starter. After 8 hours of bulk fermentation, it just turns into a complete nightmare. I was crying. I was in a bad place. Let's start and do one more coil fold. And you will see, have a look, the dough is already starting to stick on my hand. You can see that on my left finger. And the dough does not hold its shape that well anymore. And the dough starts sticking more and more. What a nightmare. And it just flows away like a pancake. And now for science, let me show you. I'm not trying to take out the dough, but it just completely tears. What a nightmare. I had tears in my eyes. But yeah, whatever. For science, I'm now going to show you how I'm trying to shape this dough. And I've been here and I always wondered why this happens. Now this dough is super over fermented, way too sour. And you see it even stays in the container. Complete disaster. Now let me try to put some more shape into this. But the dough just simply won't hold its shape. Even with additional flour, no chance this dough will hold its shape. So this is really a lost cause. But I will let it proof one more time inside of the Benetton and then I'll be baking it. I hope I made my point clear. You have to bulk ferment not too little but also not too much. You have to hit exactly that sweet spot and then your bread is going to become so much better. And it's hard, but there's a trick that I always do. I like to take a tiny piece of the dough after I mixed in my starter, and I take that piece of dough and put it into a separate jar. I mark that jar with a rubber band. Then I just check over time whether my dough doubled in size or not. And if your dough doubled in size, chances are that your bulk fermentation is complete. This is really a good trick that I do on every bake nowadays. Now the last point on the list, point number 3, proofing. Proofing is the last part of the whole fermentation process. With proofing, you shaped your balloon and now you want your balloon to inflate to the maximum. You don't want to inflate it too little, you also don't want to inflate it too much. So the question really is, for how long should you proof? And some recipes will tell you proof for 2 hours, others for 3 hours, others for 1 hour, others for 24 hours in the fridge. And what should you exactly do? And there's no easy answer to this, because this really depends on your environment. It depends on how warm it is. The warmer it is, the faster this whole process goes. The more sourdough starter you added, the faster this goes. It depends on the level of activity of your sourdough starter. So many factors that determine this. And there's one good way to figure out when proofing is done that always works. You want to take your finger and you want to put that into your dough. You want to poke your dough. Don't poke it too much. And have a look at the dent. If the dent springs back instantly, it's not ready. If it springs back very slowly, your dough is ready for the next stage. And if the dent just stays all the time, danger zone, you might have overproofed. First up, an underproofed dough. You can see the dough just springs back instantly. Not ready yet. Next up, a dough that proofed just right. You can see how the dent recovers. I always recommend to touch your dough where you have a little bit of flour on the surface or put some flour on your finger. Now this really takes a little bit of time to get used to it, but after a while this will feel just naturally. Good looking dough, this would be ready to bake. And let me show you now what happens when you overproof. You can see here the dent does not recover at all. And yeah, this is totally overproofed, a complete disaster. So that's about the finger poke test. And what I personally like to do is after it passed the finger poke test, I take my dough and I put it in the fridge overnight for another 8 hours. What happens is the gas will cool down inside of your dough. And when that cold gas will expand during baking, you will have much more oven spring. This is a really good hack that helps me with my oven spring. And also, it helps you with making it easier to score your loaf. Scoring a cold dough is much easier than scoring a dough that has room temperature. And we arrived at the end of the video and I hope you learned how important fermentation is. Definitely try to upgrade your fermentation game because this is definitely the biggest parameter, the biggest impact you have on baking better bread. Thanks a lot for watching.